This is what racial profiling looks like, even when you're a judge in a tailored suit. The hallway was quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful. No, this was the kind that feels like people are holding their breath just out of sight. Ezekiel Monroe stood alone near the east corridor of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., his back straight, hands resting on his cane, navy suit, silver cufflinks, his wedding band still shining after 52 years. His eyes scanned the paintings on the wall, former justices, faces from a different time. He wasn't in a rush. He liked to take his time. He'd been invited to speak at a private ceremony, honoring the anniversary of a landmark case he'd helped shape decades ago. His name wasn't on the plaques, but if you knew, you knew. The kind of name whispered in law school classrooms, the kind of name still quoted in legal journals. But none of that mattered to Officer Travis Miller. "Excuse me, sir." Miller's voice was sharp, too sharp. "Can I see your ID?" Ezekiel turned, surprised. "Of course," he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his suit. "I'm here for the Winslow event." Officer Hannah Beck stood just behind Miller, one hand on her belt, watching Ezekiel like he might bolt. Miller took the ID, looked at it, flipped it over like it was fake. "And what are you doing back here?" "I was told to wait here. Justice Winslow's assistant, Marcus or Morris, I forget his name, he asked me to wait while they finish up the chamber." "You were told to wait here in this hallway?" Miller asked again. "Yes," Ezekiel said calmly. "This hallway." Miller didn't like that. "You don't have any credentials on you. No badge, no pass." "I wasn't given one," Ezekiel said, "but I have the invitation on my phone." "Let me see it." Ezekiel pulled out his phone, scrolling slowly. His hands weren't as quick as they used to be, but before he could find the message, Miller stepped closer. "You don't need to be on your phone. You need to answer my questions." Ezekiel stopped, looked up. For the first time, his calm wavered just a little. "Son," he said slowly, "I've been answering questions for longer than you've been alive. But right now, what you're doing, it's not procedure. It's assumption." Miller's jaw clenched. "What did you say to me?" "I said," Ezekiel repeated, "you're making assumptions. And I suggest you radio someone who knows what they're doing before you embarrass yourself." That was it. The moment. The flick of the match. But sometimes people are more interested in proving their power than admitting they're wrong. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Officer Miller's voice cut through the stillness like a slap. Ezekiel blinked. For a second, he thought maybe he'd misheard. "Excuse me. You're refusing to comply with a lawful order. Hands behind your back." Ezekiel didn't move. Not out of pride, not out of arrogance, but out of sheer disbelief. "I just showed you my ID. I told you who invited me. You didn't even check with anyone. You just decided." Miller cut him off. "Sir, this is your last warning." Beck shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't said a word yet. She looked young, 28 maybe, new to D.C., still figuring out who she was supposed to be in the uniform. You could tell she was following Miller's lead, but wasn't quite sold on it. "Miller," she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. "Don't," he snapped. "Procedure is procedure." Ezekiel took a deep breath and gently set his phone on the bench beside him. "I'll go with you," he said softly. "But I'm telling you, you're making a mistake you're not going to forget." Miller moved quickly, too quickly. He yanked Ezekiel's hands behind his back like he was dealing with a threat, not a 76-year-old man with a cane. The metal cuffs clanked as they locked around his wrists. Ezekiel winced. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, eyes ahead, quiet. Beck finally spoke. "We really doing this in here? In the Supreme Court building?" Miller turned toward her, lips tight. "You saw him. No ID badge, no pass. Could have been casing the place for all we know." Beck shook her head but didn't push it. She walked ahead, clearing the path as Miller led Ezekiel down the hallway, past portraits of the nation's most respected legal minds, some of whom Ezekiel had once debated in courtrooms across the country. As they walked, a clerk from one of the justices' offices stepped into the hallway and paused, doing a double take. "Wait, Judge Monroe?" the clerk asked, confused. Ezekiel turned his head but didn't stop walking. "Tell Justice Winslow I won't make it on time," he said. The clerk's mouth fell open, glancing between the cuffs and the two officers escorting him. Miller didn't stop, didn't ask questions, didn't care. They led him to a side room near the security area, sat him down roughly in a chair, and stood watch like he was a threat. "You'll be processed and questioned," Miller muttered, pacing. "We'll figure out who you really are." Ezekiel chuckled quietly. "Something funny, old man?" "No," Ezekiel replied. "I'm just thinking how strange it is to be treated like this in the very building where I once gave testimony that changed federal law." Beck shifted again. She was clearly uncomfortable now. Ezekiel turned to her. "What's your name?" "Officer Beck. You know who Justice Clara Winslow is, don't you?" "Of course." "I'm her guest." Beck looked at Miller. "Maybe we should call her office." Miller snapped. "We followed the chain of command, not rumors from a suspect." Ezekiel leaned back, resting his cuffed wrists on the edge of the chair. "Then call your supervisor," he said, steady as ever. "And while you're at it, give me my phone call. I'd like to speak with my attorney." But some calls don't go to attorneys. Some calls go to people with the power to shake the walls you think are holding you up. Beck hesitated before pulling out her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Beck requesting confirmation on a detained individual, possible guest of Justice Winslow. Name Ezekiel Monroe. Can we get a contact from her chambers to verify?" There was silence on the other end, a pause, then static, then a voice. "Hold for confirmation. Stand by." Miller rolled his eyes. "Waste of time." Ezekiel didn't respond. He looked down at the table in front of him, the cuffs digging slightly into his wrists. The table was scratched, one of those institutional fold-out kinds. It reminded him of the ones in community centers and jury deliberation rooms. He'd sat at hundreds like it, always on the other side. "You know what bothers me the most?" Ezekiel said, not lifting his eyes. Miller didn't answer, just kept pacing. Ezekiel looked up slowly. "You didn't even ask who I was. You looked at me, and that was enough for you." Miller smirked. "I go off behavior, not looks." "No, you go off fear," Ezekiel said, "and it makes you dangerous." Before Miller could reply, the door cracked open. A man in a navy suit stepped in, breathing a little harder than someone in a suit usually does. "Who authorized this?" the man barked. "This is Monroe, Judge Ezekiel Monroe, guest of Justice Winslow. What the hell are you doing?" Miller stood straight. "Sir, he had no credentials. We followed protocol." "No, you didn't. You followed whatever nonsense is in your head. That man was supposed to be escorted to the chambers, not cuffed like a shoplifter." The man turned to Beck. "Who's in charge here?" She glanced at Miller, then back at the staffer. Technically, he was lead on the contact. The man threw his hands in the air. "Unbelievable." He walked over to Ezekiel and began unlocking the cuffs. "Sir, I am so sorry." "It's fine," Ezekiel said, standing up slowly. "I'm not hurt, just disappointed." He rubbed his wrists, picked up his cane, and adjusted his tie. "Justice Winslow is expecting you," the staffer said. "She's already been notified. She's not happy." Ezekiel raised one brow. "No, I imagine she wouldn't be." Miller took a step forward. "Wait, so you really are a judge?" Ezekiel turned his head. "Was. Retired now, but yes. I spent 40 years making sure men like you couldn't just do what you just did. Apparently, I missed a few spots." The room went still. Ezekiel turned to Beck. "I appreciate you checking on the radio. Don't let silence turn you into someone you're not." Beck nodded slightly. She couldn't quite look him in the eye. "Let's go," the staffer said. As they stepped out of the holding room, the hallway felt different. Quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. More like the kind before a thunderstorm. A few clerks had gathered near the chamber entrance. Whispers, raised eyebrows. But Ezekiel just walked, head high, cane tapping softly with each step. But a walk like that doesn't erase what just happened. It only pushes the question louder. How far does your name carry when your face speaks louder? Justice Clara Winslow stood just outside her chambers, arms folded, lips tight. She wasn't wearing her robe yet, still in her dark blue pantsuit, but her presence alone made the room still. Ezekiel approached slowly, guided by the staffer. When their eyes met, a flicker of something passed between them. Not shock, not pity, just that quiet understanding that only comes with decades of knowing how the world works. "Zeke," she said, voice calm but tight. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "Not your fault." Her eyes moved past him toward the two officers still lingering at the end of the corridor. I want their names, she said to her aide, and their supervisors, today. Yes, ma'am, he replied. She turned to Ezekiel. You all right? I'm fine, he said. Nothing I haven't seen before, but I didn't expect to see it here. Winslow shook her head slowly. Neither did I. They walked into her office, door clicking shut behind them. The walls were lined with books, framed photographs of her with justices, activists, foreign leaders. On the far end, a photo of Ezekiel swearing her in, years ago. You want to cancel the speech? She asked, walking behind her desk. I'll shut it down right now. He shook his head. No, I want them to hear it. Every single one of them. She nodded, sat down, and leaned forward on her desk. I'm going to make this right, she said. Ezekiel gave a half smile. You already have. That's the difference between now and 40 years ago. Back then, I'd have been dragged outside and put on a curb. Clara glanced out the window. They're going to feel this. I don't want revenge, he said. I want memory. I want them to remember that today, in the highest court of this country, a man with no weapon, no aggression, no threat, still got treated like a suspect. And if that can happen here, where else can't it? She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, Want some coffee before we go in? He chuckled. Only if it's that awful strong stuff you used to brew when we clerked in St. Louis. She laughed. That machine's long gone, but the bitterness lives on. As she got up to grab the pot, Ezekiel leaned on his cane and glanced back at the door. You know what burns the most? He said, his voice lower now. Not the cuffs, not the humiliation, not even the assumptions. It's the fact that those boys walked in here with more power than knowledge. They didn't know who I was, didn't care, and they were ready to bet their badge I didn't belong. That's the part that eats at you. Justice Winslow poured 2 cups and brought one over. I know it does, but we're not done fixing this place. No, he said, taking a sip. We're not. Just then, her aide returned. It's time. They walked together toward the chamber doors. Behind them, the whispers were louder now. Word had spread. A judge in cuffs. Inside these walls. Ezekiel didn't want pity. He didn't need it. What he wanted was attention. Not for himself, but for the truth. For the plain, uncomfortable truth that no badge, title, or legacy could shield you from being mistaken for a problem when you looked like him. Outside, Beck sat on a bench, head down, staring at her shoes. Miller stood by the wall, jaw tight, arms crossed. Neither spoke as Ezekiel walked by. He stopped, looked at them. You know, he said, I spent my life writing opinions, not living inside them. But today, I became one. Think about that. And he walked into the chamber. But some lessons don't end at the courtroom door. They follow you, long after the gavel drops. Back in the security wing, Officer Beck sat stiffly in a small conference room, arms crossed tight across her chest. Her partner, Miller, stood near the wall, hands on his hips, eyes bouncing between the floor and the door. They'd been pulled from active duty the moment word got out. Not officially suspended, but benched. A quiet, uncomfortable pause while the brass figured out how to spin the story. Do you know who that was? Beck finally said, her voice dry. Miller didn't answer. That was the guy who helped write the decision on Walker v. Jennings. That's federal law, man. Miller scoffed. He didn't look like anyone. Beck snapped. Exactly. He didn't look like anyone. So you threw cuffs on him. He pointed at her. Don't act like you weren't standing right there. You didn't stop it either. Beck stood. Because I trusted you knew what you were doing. But the moment he spoke, I knew something was off. You just didn't want to hear it. Silence. Beck walked to the door and leaned on it. You know what I keep thinking about? The way he looked at me when he asked my name. Not like he was mad. Like he was disappointed. Miller didn't respond. He didn't have anything left to say. Meanwhile, upstairs in the chamber, the crowd had gone quiet. Justice Winslow stood at the podium, clearing her throat. Before we begin, I'd like to say something that's not on the program. She gestured to the side. Ezekiel walked out slowly, cane in hand, back straight. His presence brought a stillness to the room. Judges, clerks, interns, even a few senators in the back rows, all turning their heads to watch him approach. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, This is Judge Ezekiel Monroe. Some of you know him. Some of you owe your careers to the cases he argued, the legislation he influenced, and the paths he cleared long before most of us were allowed through the door. He took the mic. The room fell silent. I wasn't going to say anything, he began, but silence only works for the people already being heard. He paused. This morning, I was mistaken for a trespasser, cuffed, detained, right here, in the halls I've walked 100 times. Why? Because the young man in uniform didn't know who I was, and didn't bother to ask. A few people shifted in their seats. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm not here to ruin careers. I'm here to remind you, justice isn't just about the letter of the law. It's about the spirit of it. And that spirit dies a little every time we let fear speak louder than facts. He glanced at Winslow. When I was allowed one phone call, I called her, not because I needed saving, but because I needed a witness. Someone who'd stand beside me when truth walked into the room in handcuffs. He looked back at the crowd. Some of you still think you'd never do what that officer did. I'm telling you, you might. It only takes one bad second, one snap judgment, and the damage, it lingers. But while pain can linger, so can clarity. And clarity can change the whole damn room. Downstairs, a door creaked open. It wasn't loud, but somehow it felt heavy. The kind of sound that breaks tension without trying to. Officer Beck looked up from her seat. A tall, sharp-suited man stepped in. Assistant Director Raymond Lowell from Capitol Police Internal Affairs. Word was he didn't usually come down in person, but this wasn't a usual day. He didn't sit, didn't shake hands. I read the report. I watched the footage, he said, eyes fixed on Miller. You had no reason to detain Judge Monroe. He complied. He explained. You ignored. Miller straightened up, clearly trying to hold on to what little he had left. Sir, we followed the initial threat assessment protocol. No visible credentials, standing alone in a secured zone. Lowell cut him off. A secured zone where he was invited. He was listed, Miller. You could have made one call. Instead, you made a choice. Miller looked at Beck, then back at Lowell. So what now? Lowell looked at both of them. What now is consequences? What now is accountability? And what now is public? Beck's face tightened. Public? Lowell nodded. The press is already calling. Judge Monroe gave a speech this morning that's lighting up the news cycle. Civil rights groups are circling. This story isn't going away. Miller exhaled hard through his nose. You're gonna hang us out to dry. Lowell narrowed his eyes. No, you hung yourself out to dry, and you dragged your partner down with you. Beck stood suddenly. With respect, sir, I tried to stop it. I asked him to slow down. I radioed dispatch. I saw, Lowell said. That's why you're walking out of here with a write-up, not a box. Beck let out a breath and nodded. Miller sat down heavily. Lowell turned to leave, then paused at the door. You know what the worst part is? He said without turning around. You embarrassed this institution in the one place where respect should be untouchable. You walked into the house of law and showed the country how easy it is to break it. Then the door closed behind him. Across the building, Ezekiel stood in a side hallway again. Same place, same corridor. The event was over. Handshakes had been exchanged. Cameras had been packed up. But he lingered for a moment. Justice Winslow joined him. You ready to go? She asked. Yeah, he said quietly. Just had to look around one last time. She followed his gaze down the corridor. Still your house, Zeke? He smiled. Nah, it never was. I just helped keep the lights on for a while. But every house has a foundation, and sometimes it takes a crack to see just how deep it runs. 2 days later, the clip went viral. Not of the arrest. There was no footage of that, but of the speech. Ezekiel Monroe, standing in front of a microphone with his cane by his side, telling a truth that was hard to hear and even harder to ignore. Cable news couldn't stop looping it. Talk radio chewed it up. Even the late-night hosts weighed in. But what caught fire the most wasn't what he said. It was where he said it. Inside the Supreme Court of the United States, in the heart of the very system he once helped build. Ezekiel didn't care for the attention. He hadn't asked for it. He didn't even watch the news coverage. He sat on his porch in Norfolk, sipping coffee, watching the waves roll in. His wife, Dolores, sat beside him, knitting in silence. You know they're calling you a national treasure, she said with a soft smile. He grunted. I've been called worse. She laughed gently. Proud of you, Zeke. He didn't say anything at first, then softly, I just wanted people to see, to understand how easy it is to forget who someone really is when you're staring through fear instead of facts. Dolores looked at him. You think they saw it? He nodded. Some did, some won't. But I did my part. Meanwhile, Officer Beck was transferred to community outreach. It wasn't a punishment, it was a reset. And it changed her. She started attending the kinds of panels she once thought were just for show. She even read Judge Monroe's old court opinions, every one she could find. As for Miller, he took a leave of absence. Word was, he wasn't coming back. Not because he was fired, but because the mirror started feeling too heavy to look into. Justice Winslow issued a formal apology on behalf of the court. It wasn't flashy, just a quiet statement reminding the public that respect doesn't wear a uniform, and dignity isn't proven with credentials. That line stuck. High school classrooms printed it on their walls. Law professors added it to their lectures. Civil rights leaders quoted it on stage. But Ezekiel? He just went back to his life. Early mornings, quiet walks, the occasional invitation to speak, most of which he turned down. Except one. 6 months later, he stood on stage at the University of Michigan, speaking to a sea of law students. Young, hungry, sharp, the next generation. He looked at them, took a breath, and said, Don't spend your whole career trying to prove you belong. Spend it making sure others don't get pushed out just because they don't look like they do. That line? That one got a standing ovation. Because in the end, the question isn't just who belongs here. The question is, who decides? If this story moved you, share it, talk about it, reflect on it. These moments don't just happen in headlines. They happen in hallways, in lobbies, in classrooms, in your own neighborhood. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not walk past it in silence.